Before I jump into my notes, is there any question that you guys have or anything you want me to clarify real quick before I get into my notes? The notes may clarify some of your questions, but I do want to kind of give you guys the space to ask questions if you have them. Um, so, this book is titled They Came Before Columbus. The author of the book is Ivan Van Sertima. You kind of get a thrust of what the book is about in the sense of trying to document the African presence in the Americas prior to European invasion, prior to the institution of enslavement. So I'll just kind of go through and work through some of the things that I found of significance or importance throughout the text. I'll highlight and point to some pages that I'm pulling this information from. If you guys want to follow along, you could do so. And then from there, we'll open it up to our fishbowl conversation. So one of the points of significance for me, and it really details the Africanity of the individuals that they're articulating and they're talking and discussing. Is on page 94, towards the middle of the page here. It's the second paragraph towards the middle of the second paragraph. It says, "These foreigners, on the other hand, wore feathered headdresses, polished and brilliant earrings, cloaks and loincloths of the finest woven cotton." And this is what becomes important to me. This is really what signifies the Africanity of these individuals. Small white shells on their ankles that rattled softly as they walked. Is anyone familiar with a cowrie shell? It's like a white shell that comes out of Africa. Yeah, so I see Helena shaking her head. It looks like these. So these would be considered cowrie shells, right? And so these are those soft white shells that were on the ankles that Van Sertima is talking about. And again, these are strictly derived out of Africa. In some societies, these were used as currency. So for me, this lets me know that we are dealing with an African people who was, making their presence here on the Americas. Um, and then it says later on page 94 that they built a temple as soon as they formed a sizable community to honor the werewolf god. And if we think about to the lecture that I gave on what was that Tuesday, if you think about Imhotep, the builder of the first step pyramids, you think about how Kemet was structured with a lot of statues that honored the gods and honored a lot of deities. You see that same type of behavior here in the Americas when the African people touch down and they develop a sizable community. They do the same thing that they were doing back home as far as building these statues and these homages to the gods, right? Um, and then it also says, this is also from page 94, um, it's Mexico, however, that we are most concerned, for here we can see the confluence of cultures, not just the confluence of bloods. When we compare the coat of the werewolf, the coyote of the prairies, found among the Amoteca, with the coat of the werewolf, the hyena of the savannas, found among the Bambara of medieval Mali, we see quite clearly that there are at the very head of this confluence. Okay, and this kind of gets to the question that was posed in our breakout rooms, right? So he's talking about not only do you see the confluence of cultures, so the merging of cultures, but obviously, right, there's the merging of blood as well. So naturally, when people get together, right, they have relations and the blood mixes, right? But what Van Sertima is pointing us to is the confluence of culture. And for me, and we could discuss what you guys talked about in your breakout rooms, but for me, the confluence of culture becomes more fecund because it shows that there's a harmony at play, right? It's natural that people intermingle when they meet one another. That's a natural human phenomenon, but it's not natural that the cultures get interfused with one another, right? And he's bringing this to our attention through the cult of the werewolf, right? And they say that the werewolf is the coyote of the prairie, right? So here in the Americas, there's not going to be hyenas. There's going to be coyotes, though, right? So the werewolf is symboled in this coyote, but back home in Africa, it was the hyenas, right? That's how they understood and interpreted who the werewolf was, right? So what you see also is them picking up things that they find similar to their understanding of animals and feathers and things of that nature from back home. They'll find the most similar representation of that here in the Americas, and they'll do the same type of rituals, the same type of activities, and the same type of practices, right? So to me, this shows not only that they're mingling, but they're exchanging cultural ideas with one another, right? And again, to go back to the question that Helena posed last week, when they traveled outside of Africa, was there the dominance that took place? And I think Van Sertima would argue no, it was a confluence of cultures, right? They were able to get along harmoniously and share and exchange information. And to me, that's very important when you're looking at how Africans traveled and migrated through the world. And then so on page 96, again, going back to this confluence of culture, he talks about how those rituals were done twice a year on both Africa and in Mexico. So I'll read the passage here. It's the second paragraph on page 96. And it says, "It is with Mexico, however, that we are most concerned for." Actually, I'm sorry, we already talked about that. Let me move down to a little bit better, lower on the page. So I'm going to go to this section here towards the bottom of the page. I'm going to pick up the last paragraph on that page. "In the Mexican ritual, the god of the Amanteca is clothed in the werewolf skin. Although it wears a human mask on its head, this is identical with the Bambara ritual. In the Mexican ritual, the god wields a stick knobbed with black stones. This imitates the stick wielded by the werewolf god of the Bambara. For that too is knobbed, though with fragments of sheep's horns. The Brevard Ritual involves the feathered carcasses of two great birds. In Mexico, a pot is carried on the back of the god with numerous feathers of a bird introduced from the tropical south by the Poncheca, namely the Quetzaltali bird. In Mexico, the god wore an anklet of small white rattles." Okay, again, so you think about those small white rattles, think about those cowrie shells, right? Rattles are used in the Babar ritual, not just the ankle rattle of the cult dancers, but the gourd rattle, favorite paraphernalia of the African magicians, right? So again, this gives us a very sterling example of how these cultures reflected themselves across the Atlantic. I'll skip past that. And then they go into this section on page 99 with Dr. Alfonso Digari, and he talks about, this kind of gets to the confluence of blood, right? And he says that they found African characteristics in the blood type of the indigenous people of the Americas, right? And they had this anti-malaria sickle cell strand that was in the blood that was really from Africa, because as you know, malaria is something that is really prevalent in Africa, right? So if that's something that's very prevalent in your country, your body will build up natural defense mechanisms to keep that off of you. So when you travel and you intermingle, that same gene was passed down to the indigenous people of the Americas. So again, this speaks to that blood confluence that Van Sertima was talking about earlier in the chapter. And then, and forgive me if I mispronounce this, but the god, the Ekchakua, Ekchua, this is the beekeeping god that they say is very prevalent in Mexico, but they also have remnants of that same god in Africa. I'm on the bottom of page 100 now. All these aspects of Ekchua link him unequivocally to the old beekeeping god found in Nama worship among the Mandingo. In Nama worship, the god, represented as an old man, was sometimes put in a beehive, used as a tabernacle, while his devotees drank a honeyed drink and danced and howled around him. The medieval Mexicans celebrated the festival of Echuca on the same day as the holiday of Hobanil, the god of the beekeeper. And during this feast, they drank 3 bowls of honey wine. So again, not only do they do the same thing during the ritual, they participate in practice of ritual on the very same day. And again, this is all the way across the Atlantic. So we could say that's a great coincidence, or we could say that's African migration and infusing their cultures with the people that they intermingle with. I talked about that. So also I found of great importance when he talks about the people of Mali. And before I go into that, when he's talking about these Mandingo people, think back to last week's, or was that Tuesday's lecture, and and I talked about Mansa Musa, right? And he being the wealthiest man on the planet. I talked about him building up the Mali Empire, establishing the University of Sangar, and establishing Timbuktu. So he is a Mandingo, right? He's part of the Mandingo tribe. In fact, his brother Abu Bakari sailed to, and I think we talked about this in the lecture on Tuesday. That was his brother Abu Bakari who sailed to the Americas 200 years prior to Columbus, right? So these are the same people that come from the same region of Mansa Musa who are being described within the pages of this text that we're reading from Ivan van Sertima. So when you think about the Mandingo people, think about the people who come from where Mansa Musa is coming from. In fact, if you go to the top of page 103, they say explicitly that these are the same people from Mali, right? And I'm gonna read. I'm gonna start with. Actually, I'll start with the bottom of 102, and I'll read through the middle of 103. Since many of the traders' words and trading items have been discussed have Arabic roots, it would appear that Arabic cultural influence on the medieval Mandingo was pervasive and overwhelming. This is not the case. The Islamic influence on medieval Mali hardly touched the common people. Even the kings, from Sundiata down to the king of the Atlantic expeditions, Abu Bakari II, that's the individual I was speaking of earlier, gave Islam little more than lip service. There were, of course, exceptions. Kakan Musa, Abu Bakari's half brother, took a vast horde of 60,000 Mandingos across the desert to Mecca, the Islamic heartland, in 1324. But Mali's administrative and political structure owed nothing to the Arabs. It was a theocracy, but it grew out of a federation of native families. Mandingo animist rituals and magical religious beliefs were not Arabic Islamic, although the Mandingo later took scraps of the Quran and transformed them to suit their purposes. The magicians chanted the fifth chapter of the Quran, the Fatiha, as if it were another of their magical incarnations. Arab Islamic influence on medieval Mali, therefore, was peripheral, but its impact on the trade and on traders cannot be denied. Nearly all traveling traders in Africa and West Africa became Muslim. It was the pragmatic thing to do, since nearly all foreign trade was with the Arabs. Hence, many Arabic words to be found in Mandingo trading items. Now, why is that important? Like, why would I take the time? One, why would Van Sertima take the time to write that? And then two, why would I take the time to read that to you guys and as it pertains to what we're dealing with? Why do you think that's of significance?
Those Mali people were influenced in the same way that they influenced the people in the Americas. The Muslims, the Muslim influenced them, and then they influenced others. It kind of shows the confluence of just influence of just one people to another, I might say.
Yeah, absolutely. Anybody else want to add to that? Okay, and so for me, while Marlon is absolutely right, I think it also speaks to the agency of African people, right? Because oftentimes, especially when you're dealing with African people, credit is always often placed elsewhere, right? So you talk about the pyramids, they'll say, well, shit, aliens made the pyramids because we can't figure out how it's done, so it must have been aliens, right? So it's just these constant attempts to devalue the success of African people, right? So what could be said? Well, maybe they were Arabs, right? Because there's these are Arabic root words and these are Arabic traditions. So Van Sertima is saying like, nah, let's not, before you go down that route, right? These are African people. And yes, there's an Arabic influence, but that Arabic influence is on the periphery, right? It's not pervasive within the Mandingo culture. And the only reason that the Mandingo became Muslim was just because it was a practical thing to do. I'm trading with Muslims, so now we have a common language, right? So now I can successfully go about my trade routes. So it's not that Islam took over the Mandingos, right? The Mandingos use Islam for trade purposes. And I think that becomes very significant because it centralizes and it places the attention on the agency of African people, right? If you think back to the framework, African American male theory, African people are born with an innate capacity for brilliance, right? And this is centered in that notion of the African American male theory. Um, so I found that of great importance. But you're also right. It's a meta theory in the sense that what you see the Mandingos doing here in the Americas took place with them with the Islamic influence as well. Um, and then he has this on page 105, page 106, excuse me. He has this thing too where he says, sorry, 105. I was right. 105, paragraph of 105. He says, we have been concentrating in this chapter on the evidence of Mandingo traders in Mexico, but it would be wrong to suppose that the Mandingos settled only there, and that is only in Mexico that their influence may be demonstrated. So he goes on to say where other places where they relocated and they spread their influence. But on page 106, towards the middle, he kind of gives us some more information. This is on the second paragraph of page 106. There were several bases from which the African traders spread in the two Americas, from the Caribbean in the Songhai period of 1462 through 1492, from northeastern South America in the Mandingo period, 1310 onward into Peru, and from a base in Darien moving along roads marked by the presence of burial mounds into and beyond Mexico as far north as Canada. Now, the burial grounds becomes important, right? Because again, think back to our lecture that we had on Tuesday about why these Cometics constructed temples. These temples were essentially to homage the dead, right? To pay homage to their ancestors. And you see African people doing the same thing, creating these burial grounds all the way from Mexico to the north of Canada. Far north is Canada, right? So all throughout this Western hemisphere, from Canada to South America, African people are creating these burial sites to reverence their ancestors, right? So you see a consistent reoccurring theme where African people travels. They're going to honor their gods, they're going to honor their ancestors, and they're going to, more or less act in harmony with those who they come into contact with. Excuse me. So those are my notes. From here, we'll jump into the Fishbowl. With the Fishbowl, it's not really a big deal. You could talk about what you guys mentioned in the breakout rooms. You could talk about literally what you wrote in your journal. You could talk about what I just mentioned in my mini lecture. Anything's on the table, right? It's just very casual. Whatever thoughts or anything of significance, just speak on that, and then you'll get your credit for fishbowling, and that will satisfy your participation points for this semester. Does anybody?
Is the fishbowl in particular to the Mandingo reading, or can we talk about the Haiti documentary?
You can talk about that too.
The myths and stuff.
Yeah, you could definitely. I would say let's keep it to the Haiti documentary because that was required. We won't. I won't spend too much time on the additional material because that was additional and everybody may not have read that. But definitely, if you want to bring in the Haitian documentary, we could do that as well because I think this has a lot of good points also. So whatever's on any of those things can be on the table. Does anyone want to volunteer? All right. One. Okay.
All right. I don't want to dominate the class or anything. Sorry.
No worries. Let me just get two more people and then we'll move forward. Before I call anybody at random, Natalie, is your hand up? Before I call anybody at random, Natalie, is your hand up? All right. I think 2 is good because it's a small class. So Marlon, if you want to start, feel free. And then Natalie, you'll be next.
All right. Just I I'd actually like to do a comment. Well, I can do a comment on on each. Um, but just a comment on the myths and stereotypes. I thought that article was even more interesting than the Mandingo article. It gave such a great overview of the history of Africans and their influence. I mean, it was a lot more steeped in their influence on and from Europe, but it's a really great introduction, kind of overall of Africans around the world, and then I mean, there's a smaller part where they come to America, but I think it's a really great foundation to kind of what we're talking about in the diaspora and all that. And I think you're crazy for not making it required reading. It doesn't even take that long, and it's there's a lot of really great information in it. But what I'd like to say something about or ask about actually is the Haiti documentary, which is interesting and just so much about Haiti and kind of the perspective that we as Americans might get, that it just seems like an impoverished country, a third world country, but there's so much of a rich history, and it just the people of it. It really paints it as a really interesting place. I don't know if every country in the world could do the same. I don't know if Haiti IT is extraordinary in that way, or it's just what they made out in the documentary. But my question is kind of more about the revolution of 1804, and I'm kind of wondering because as I started watching it, I realized that like I've never even heard of this, and I've never really done a lot of research on AT and a lot of the rest of the world. It's been a long time since I've even taken a history class, and I don't know if they teach about that in like a social studies class or something. But I was so fascinated by the revolution that took place, and it just kind of made me think like I'd like to ask a question for the rest of the class. Do you guys have a background on that? Have you ever even heard of that revolution? And you can totally say yes or no. You can say that man, what kind of history class did you take that you never even got that? But it also seems to me like in a way that you talk about certain blind spots in the news and keeping information away from the people, it almost seems like you don't want to tell other people or students or people or possible revolutionaries that this was the one time in history around the world that there was a slave uprising for the people in IT that came up and it succeeded, and they actually did triumph. I mean, the consequences of that was, they're still impoverished and they were still oppressed by the rest of the world, including not even minimally the United States, but that it's impoverishment that even comes today. And then, I just go back to the earthquake that I remember from 2010. That seemed like I remember thinking like, wow, it's a poor country in the first place, and then the horrible disaster that came in. And I did find the documentary to be fascinating. It goes on a little bit, but also I was able to I couldn't watch the whole thing all at one time, but I stopped right before the aftermath, which I think there's another good 35 minutes in the rest of it. And it was a really good actually, coincidentally, a really good place to stop to have almost like the past history and then the current time and everything that happened in the time since. So yeah, I think that's I don't know if that's exactly what you wanted us to do in the Fishbowl. I don't know if that was too much, but there you go. That's my opinions of it, of the material we've covered.
No, that's perfect, Marlon. That's exactly what I'm looking for. We could either, if anyone wants to respond to Marlon, we could open up that space, and if not, we could jump right into Natalie.
I'd like to ask if anybody else has had experience in learning about the 1804 revolution, just a yes or no. I'd like to know if anybody else has had any experience with that.
Nah, And I think even to further articulate your point, Marlon, even at the time that it happened, right? If you pay attention to the documentary, they really try to suppress the fact that that revolution took place. They didn't want the Americas to get wind of what happened in Haiti, right? So that is it's a historical phenomenon that's really threatening to the pervasiveness and the long-standingness of modernity, right? And to really start to get into that conversation shows that this is something that's not infallible, that cannot be taken down, and that's not going to last forever. So I think the Western world does a very great job of keeping this information suppressed from the masses of the people. So that's a really good question. Natalie?
One of my biggest questions was, why did we learn about the Holocaust, but we don't learn about the same gassing that happened in Haiti? And I think I had like a lot of trouble trying to understand why we keep suppressing all of this information and the truth of probably, if not all of the other countries that do have, um, you know, slaves coming in, going out. All of our culture is influenced by Africa. And I think there needs to be more conversation on it and to not be afraid of knowing the truth.
You know, you're absolutely right, Natalie. And typically I save this portion of my conversation until we get into Baldwin. But I think just because your question that you're asking is so fecund as it relates to Baldwin, and Megan, I see your hand. I'll say this and we'll jump to you. But when we get into Baldwin, I talk about the two pillars of white supremacy. And I call it white inferiority because even to call it supremacy is a false notion, right? But those two pillars are the maintenance of white innocence and then the white imagination. And specifically, the maintenance of white innocence becomes really fecund when we're talking about the question you're posing, right? Because if we start to make these conversations more mainstream, right, then it's going to start to erode the very fabric that America stands on, right? You can't say that we're a country on democracy, founded on democracy, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, when you know that, one, we had slaves, right? We've done these things to slaves, right? Um, even countries like France, right? Like France thinks of itself as a post-racial country, right? All the French citizens are considered to be French, right? You're not black, you're not white, you're French, okay? But as you've seen in the documentary, to this day, Haiti is still paying reparations, as crazy as that sounds, to France, right? So to even have those conversations is going to begin to erode the very fabric of French society, right? The very economic base that French holds, right? So one thing about power is people in power don't want to get that shit up, right? And they'll go through great lengths to keep and maintain their position in power, you know? And if that means lie, steal, cheat, we gonna lie, steal, and cheat to keep my position in power. And to me, that's one of the core reasons as to why this remains a secret. One of the core reasons as to why critical race theories cannot be discussed in your K through 12 campuses, right? Because they don't want this truth to get out. You know, very very good question, Natalie. Megan, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment on that. Um, I don't think it's pronounced Natalie. Nathalie? Okay, but anyways, I'm so sorry. But I also think it's because, that was the Holocaust was obviously like so tragic and terrible, but I think we learn about that way more in depth than we learn about anything like this, even in primary school, which is crazy because it's also really terrible. Anyways, but it's because it wasn't like America's terribleness necessarily. Like, where it's like, oh, it's those white people, it's those Germans that are doing it. So not only is it putting the blame like, oh, it's them, it's not us this time, that we learn about that because we look like the heroes. We come in and we help all these people. And it just is this like hero complex that's why I believe that we are able to learn about these things at a young age, because they want to instill in you that America is great. And we do learn about the civil rights movement and enslavement. I think it starts in like 5th grade or so. But with that, you only learn about like the atrocities of it. And you learn about enslavement, and then you learn about the civil rights, and there's in that no responsibility taken anywhere. There is no how it changes not only the entire continent of Africa, but how it shapes history today, how we are still going through these things today. And it's all about, like you're saying, like the oppression of information. If you don't know these things, there can't be an uprising, there can't be opinions about it if it is completely sheltered from your history. So that's my, opinion on why we can learn about certain things but not other things, even though they're all terrible things that most of the time are our fault. But we don't learn about how in depth it goes, but we can learn about the Holocaust because that wasn't, our fault. That was those people, that wasn't us. So
Helena?
Yeah, actually, just jumping off of that just gave me like brought back a memory of kind of like in elementary school. I remember in grade 2, we started learning about enslavement and the Underground Railroad and those more of like the struggle, which is all also really important. And like right after that, though, we were learning about like the significance of um like medieval times and like Greek mythology and ancient Rome and like all these other places, like European places, and kind of like about their culture and their significance and the way they dressed and the food they ate. But when we were learning about African history, it was always about the struggle, about never about the cultural significance or the influence or the history. And so I was kind of wondering, like, why do we always, it's always related toward the struggle, which is important because it's still going on and it is more recent. But we our like education is just limited to if we even get a good education about African history, it's always limited to like after enslavement, after that period, for me at least, from in my experience in school, and not before. But we learn about all the European stuff from before. And also, I was just kind of wondering in the readings, while I was reading, like, since African people made their presence known and made so many contributions um, and influenced so many people and places, when did the notion come up in Europe of like going to Africa to exploit these people? Like after like centuries of them being like making such a big impact. That's what I'm still wondering.
That's a really good question. I know, Megan, you had your hand up, and then I'll let you go now respond to Helena's question.
yeah, and I feel like it's because they don't want to hear about Black excellence. And I think we don't hear about the amazing things a lot of cultures do, because again, America's number one, America's this, America's that. And it's because if we realize all these other countries are doing X, Y, and Z better than us, we're no longer the best. And so they want to fuel this, narrative of, oh, well, Africa's this and Asia's that. And just, yeah, so that's what I think that's about. And going off of that, something that came up for the reading for me, and even with this conversation, is that, Africans were able to come over not looking like these people, not speaking the same language, not dressing the same, all these things, and somehow create not just like, a transactional relationship, but close relations with these people to where you're creating families, which is amazing because like you didn't even speak the same language and somehow you figured out a way to communicate, and that is like beautiful. And then we're talking about how there's like the linguistic part of like, Arabic kind of coming into these languages and everything, which means they were able to do the same things with another culture and create relationships with that, which is like mind blowing because I can't even imagine like how difficult that must have been, not speaking the same language, but getting close enough to where there's legit like dialects of words in that. Like you have to work on that for a minute. And so I'm thinking about these things, and then I can't help but wonder where, European people came over to not just what is now America, but also to Africa. And instead of, doing these relationships like everyone else is doing, they're like, you know what? We're going to absolutely exploit everything we can from you people and do that all over the world. We see that right now in the Middle East. And so I'm like, there has to be something that thing, and this is like, before race, might have been like a conceptual thing, but there has to be something within these people that allowed them the idea to exploit everyone around them. And obviously that ties directly into the superiority we have today. And so I'm like, where did that come from? That's what I want to know, because I don't know if this is like, a genetic thing, if this is like because they had the whitest skin. Like I have no idea, but that is something that I want to know, because everyone was chilling. Everyone was like doing their thing, trading, learning, becoming more sanitary, growing as communities, growing in culture. It is so beautiful. And then it just got blown up. So that's my question. If someone can answer that, please let me know.
Yeah. So I'll kind of point you in the right direction. I don't. It's a very large question to answer. But to address Helena's first question, so are there any Catholics in here? Okay. Well, sorry, y'all. I have to call it what it is, right? The Papal Bull of 1452 was the Catholic edict that took place that says we're going into Africa and we're going to civilize and bring Catholicism to these African heathens, right? So that was like on paper when this thing kind of took place, and that shift took place. And really, that's another reason why I signed the stereotype as additional reading, because it kind of speaks to that shift taking place, right? These are how African people were viewed prior to, then these things happen, and then now we have the stereotypes, right? So that's something that takes place as well. And I think on paper, that's where you really get this idea and this notion from, that we're going to make them inhuman, really, right? And then also, you said, is it a genetic thing? And to me, that's very fecund, right? So there's a book that's entitled Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome. I believe the author is Joy DeGruy. And the thesis of that book is that trauma is passed down through your DNA, epigenetics, right? And so she's focusing more so on the African experience, right? So my grandmother's grandmother's grandmother who was enslaved is passing the trauma down to my grandmother, who passes it down to my mother, who then passes it down to me, right? For men, it says that you carry up to 7 generations in your sperm, right? So that trauma that I received, I'm passing down to my children, who will pass it down to their children, who will pass it down to their children, right? Women, the same thing. And then especially it's more so with women, because you actually carry the baby with you. So the trauma that you go through carrying that baby is being passed to that baby, and that continues to be passed on, right? So if this is true, based on science, then we can't say that this is only a specified experience for African people, right? We have to say that Europeans also experience epigenetics, right? So that same trauma that is being passed down, the European is passing that down to their offspring as well, right? And this book here by Amy Césaire, The Discourse on Colonialism, Césaire is arguing that you cannot colonize people and not become inhuman yourself, right? So to beat someone till their skin is off their back, right? And then continue to do those type of practices, not only does that dehumanize that individual, more importantly, it dehumanizes you, right? So if this is true, what type of genetic trauma is being passed down to the European by generation to generation to generation to generation, right? We talk about the ice ages. Think about the climate of the ice ages. And this is where like theologies like the Nation of Islam kind of becomes helpful, just because they talk about how while they're in this ice age period, right, there's limited amounts of sun, limited amounts of being able to hunt and get resources, right? So when you're limited on your resources, what happens? You war, right? You're fighting over those resources. So they're coming from a culture to where there's scarce resources, so we're always at war. Always at war, always at war, always at war. And so now we're able to come out of these ice ages. All we know how to do is war, right? We don't know how to interact with other people. We don't know how to establish relationships because our whole ontology is built on scavenging and fighting for resources, right? So you're going to take this mentality and you're going to spread it everywhere, right? You're going to conquer, right? Manifest destiny, right? White privilege, right? So this is where, to me, if you kind of tie these threads together, this is where you can kind of see this genetic system comes from, right? This is grounded in a false notion of religious superiority, right? So all these things kind of come into place and places us in the state that we're in now, where we're having all these mass shootings, and one segment of the population is predominantly responsible for these mass shootings, but we can turn the other cheek and come up with every other excuse as to why we don't need gun control, right? It's in this. We can't take the guns away. It's anti-American, right? But let's not talk about all the kids who died in Sandy Hook, et cetera, right? So to me, if I can answer your question in a roundabout way, that's how I would go about, answering that question. I'm kind of looking at the chat.
Could you would you be able to write the name of the book and the author in the chat?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
I was gonna sign this book for us to read, but I didn't want to do too much for y'all,
I really appreciate that whole analysis because I've never thought about that before. I put in the chat, like, other countries and everything are so fruitful and, the soil is different. And so I feel like there might have not been so much war on territory, on resources, and there could have been more focus on like collectivism. And so like in your opinion, maybe is that why other countries were able to like make these connections and stuff, and it was just not like genetically unable for other, European countries to go down the same path with that.
Yeah, I think also socially, right? Because yes, it's the genetic aspect of it, but then the genetic is also informed by the social. You know what I mean? We can't. I don't think we can separate the two. But yeah. To put it plainly, absolutely, right? And when for centuries, like I'm not a historian, so I can't give you how long the ice ages were. But I mean, if you're dealing with those conditions for a long time, you're going to come out some kind of way. I mean, just think about people, just the personality difference from those who live in cold areas versus people who live in warm areas, right? Like New York to California, like it's a whole different vibe. You know what I'm saying? You get that sun, you're gonna feel a little bit different. You be able to go to the beach, you're gonna feel a little bit different. You're not gonna be so mad, right? You know what I'm saying? Motherfuckers in New York are just angry. It's like, yo, go get some sun and go to the beach and chill out. You know what I mean? So it's just those little subtle differences that does impact the way that you view and perceive things. Natalie, go ahead.
A question that I had from the chapter from the book was, if they lived in harmony, how does that feed into the casta system and how we have our own racial system? Like, are they all intertwined?
And again, I'm not a historian, but I would think you get this caste system when you get the European invasion, right? I know, so for example, I know in the Indian culture, they have like Hindu, there's a caste system, right? But I also know that India was a British colony, right? So again, not being a historian, I don't know what came first. But at the same time, I can't ignore the common denominator there, right? Like you established this caste system. Also, there's even in the black community, right? There's a color system, right? So we'll put more attention to the light-skinned baby, right? Like we hope that the baby comes out with light and what we call good hair. And good hair is typically interpreted by having long, straight hair, right? That looks more European. So this this identity or the superiority with a white phenotype, that's something that was done globally, right? And it also, again, to tie it back to religion, it goes to the image of God, right? So if God looks like this, then that has to be what the superior race must be, because that's what God is, you know? And I think it's funny, if you think back to our lecture on Tuesday, we'll create man in the image of God, right? But African people never articulated the image of God. When they depicted a God, it was an energy, it was a sun, it was an anamorphic figure, right? It wasn't an individual, right? So even this idea of colonizing the God, image of God, those are European concepts, right? And so again, not being a historian, I don't know if that will directly answer your question, but I can't help but assume that this European influence is also at the center of this notion of caste system and things of that nature, right? Because you're not going to take on a culture of a people who you feel that you're better than. It just doesn't make sense that way. If you think about assimilation, you always assimilate up to the powerful culture, right? So if there's this caste system at play and the lighter skinned people are on top of that caste system, it don't make sense that these Africans would come in and be able to spread their culture, right? And then keep in mind too, like indigenous people is hella dark. Like there, you go to Mexico, there's people as dark as me in Mexico still to this day, right? So that probably also didn't really, the skin wasn't as much of a turn off, because I'm sure they've seen people with darker hue as well, you know, if that answers your question. Any other thought? Go ahead, Helena.
Just on that note, I just found that really interesting because also like so my mom's side is Hindu and my dad's side is Catholic, but also Catholic just because of colonization. I don't know what I am. But on the Hindu side, my mom was saying that on in the north, she was always like offended. She thought it was so weird that the god statues would always because in Hinduism there's many gods and they have statues of all the different ones, and in the north they're always like very fair and have like blue eyes, and then more in the south they're darker, and it's like also when I was reading this and kind of thinking about how these people would like merge and kind of like create these new representations of gods, it was like it was a creation and a reflection rather than kind of like trying to create like an ideal. I'm trying to articulate this, but like they were creating something that actually reflected the people, not in a way of like trying to oppress the other people. Like for example, when they make the god statues lighter, when to show that it's an ideal, and those with lighter skin are higher up and more godlike. These people would like in the reading, it wasn't like they weren't using religion and gods to make an ideal that discriminated against people, I guess is what I'm trying to say. Whereas a lot, because of I think colonization, that's what that happened a lot, where they tried to use that to oppress people and kind of like show that they were less than. Yeah. And even in images of like Jesus and God and things like that, it's actually in all religions. Yeah.
Yeah, I like the idea of a reflection, more of for domination. I think that's a great way to articulate the differences in the way that, you know, religion was practiced, right? Like as an homage to, right? To honor you, just opposed to dominate you, right? And even if you listen to the way that God is articulated, like, so I do a lot of readings on indigenous spirituality from the African perspective, and like this fierce and God to be feared, you don't have that in the African spiritual context, right? It's like God's not going to punish you. He's not sending locusts. She's not sending floods. She's not going to burn your shit down. Like that's just not how God works, right? Like thinking about the story of Job, like yo, that's not a God I want to fuck with. Like, if God could put you through all of that just for a bet, like, I'm cool. Like, I could go praise another God just because I like to keep my family and my well-being, right? But yeah, it's a difference. It absolutely is a difference. Megan, you had your hand up?
Yeah, I just wanted to go off what Helena is saying because um I'm from the Philippines, and that was also like hardcore colonized like 2 or 3 times, and so it's super Catholic now. But when I went and we went into more like low-key areas, more people closer to the land and stuff like that, there it's not Catholic. It's, way like generational. I don't even know what I would call it. But the gods that they were reflecting were, like you're saying, like part of the culture, like the animals that they saw, like the vegetation that grew, things that they were thankful for. And so I feel like that makes more sense to me because it's like tangible, visible things that you can see that have helped you, like have provisions for you and your family. And so I think that might be the case in a lot of cultures. Like, they have like gods for the sun and for the moon and for these things that help you, and that it isn't, you're not supposed to be fearful of. And I guess my last comment is Jesus is definitely not white. It's literally geographically impossible. Like, homie was in the Middle East, and you're gonna tell me he was white? Like, who is gonna survive that? It's not gonna happen.
Yeah,
So that was just my last comment on that.
yeah, very true. It just like it just don't make sense. You know what I'm saying? You just kind of think about things logically, and it just doesn't make sense. So unless you guys have questions, that's all I have for you today. I would ask either Danny, Edgar, or Sophia to close us out with a comment, just because we haven't heard from you guys today.
Oh, I had a question actually before, because I know looking at the reading for the Mandingo traders in medieval Mexico, would it be safe to say, and then after you showed us the cover of the book, I'm familiar with that. Those are the Olmecs.
Yeah.
I know, and I know the Olmecs, but I had no idea that they were connected in that way to Mexico. My understanding was that they were further south, like in Brazil, and that's where the statues are. But they traveled northward to parts of Mexico.
Central Mexico down into Brazil, you'll find those Olmec statues.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I had all the information that I got today was kind of but I got stuck on the Olmec thing until you showed us the book. I've had that kind of just rattling around the back of my head.
Yeah. Normally, like when I give this lecture, there's a video that I have that accompanies this lecture that kind of goes into the Olmec statues and it really speaks to like the Africanity of them. Because if you look at the statues, like look at their nose, they actually have braids on the back of the statue's head. So again, just signifies the African presence. And kind of going back to Helena was saying, far as a representation or homage. So it has been argued, it's debated, right, whether that the indigenous people created those Olmec heads as a reflection or homage to the African people, or if the African people were kind of instrumental in shaping those statues and those figures as well,
Okay.
If you guys want, I could post the video to our Google Classroom site as like some extra material just to kind of help inform that. It's just because we're gonna have to kind of shift from this, and I see there's still some curiosity there, so I'll add that to you to the Google Classroom site. But yeah, if you guys can get the book that came before, it's a great resource just to kind of help you understand history, right? And understand not only African history, but American history, the histories of the Americas as well, because it impacts all of that, and then you start to think about how it relates to our today, and you start hearing terms like "go back to your country." It's like I am in my country, right? Like go back to Europe, you know what I mean? So if that's what you want to do, the book about post-traumatic slaves, it's called Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome. I'll put that in the chat also. Slave syndrome. And I think it's Joy DeGruy. I could have spelled this wrong, but it's DeGruy. Okay, so for next week, I'm just going to show you guys the readings for next week, and we'll call it a day. Give me 1 second. I believe it's Du Bois and Baldwin, if I'm not mistaken. But let me see. So yeah, week 2. Yeah, so read Du Bois first. So we'll talk about Du Bois for Tuesday, and then we'll talk about Baldwin for Thursday. Um, so one thing I'll say about Du Bois, I don't know if you guys read it, any of his material. The language is a little different. It's 1900s, and he talks like he's in the 1900s. So you're gonna have to kind of like siphon through a lot of shit that don't really matter. So just kind of find those words that really add to the argument. You're gonna just kind of let some things go, but it's beautifully written, and it's gonna add a lot to our conversation as we move through the rest of the semester. And then we'll pick up on Thursday dealing with Baldwin. I don't know if how many of y'all are familiar with Baldwin. It's one of my favorite writers of all time, him and Octavia Butler. So we're really gonna dive into that. Any other questions for me, you guys? So how do you guys feel about, so this will kind of be the flow of our meetings when we do meet on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Is this a good flow for you guys? Is it something that we could take away or something that you feel needs to be added? How do you feel about it?
I just wanted to thank everyone for the conversation. I feel like some of the material was a little, I felt like out of my range of knowing how to decipher it. Like I had to go through one of them like 1 or 2 times, which I was really nervous about, but I feel like just through this conversation, I feel like I learned a lot and I was really happy to like interact with everyone. It's super nice to do.
Yeah. Yeah, I completely agree. And again, like I said, the first class, like I literally learned from y'all in this conversation, right? So it's not just me giving information. So again, I echo Megan's sentiment. I definitely appreciate each and every one of you. Marlon, were you gonna say something?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting group that there's, it's a small group, but it seems like everybody is invested in it and just wants to jump in and kind of give some comments. Like you don't even have to have the format of a fishbowl, have your arguments ready. It's just we're here, we're going to put our experiences into it and kind of dive into it. And I think it's interesting too the introductions that we had on Tuesday. I think it was important. Everyone said they're major, and we've got like a really broad range of a lot of different, education, motivations and such. So I think that's really interesting. It's an interesting group, and bore out today. So good work.
I agree.
Over if my internet got out again. So yeah.
No, you good. So you do bring up a good point, Marlon. Like the fishbowl is designed to cultivate close conversation. It doesn't seem like we have that problem. And if we don't need to do it, I have no problems taking that away and just gauging how you guys interact with the conversation would determine your participation. I'm open to that. But I just want to make sure, one, that we do hear from everybody throughout the course of the semester is one of the reasons why I do the Fishbowl, and it's kind of that structure allows for that. But again, I'm open, man. If it's unnecessary, we don't have to waste time with that. We could just jump into course conversation. So we'll give it next week. We'll see how it goes, and if it doesn't need to be, I'll ask you guys what you feel, and then we'll go from there. Because I mean, again, it's your class. Whatever the majority says, I'll roll with. Any other questions, comments, or concerns for me? Okay. Starting next week, I will start talking about your paper proposals, right? Because I know that it's going to all start coming quick, and I'll start talking you guys through, abstracts. Start talking you guys through your subject matter. Start thinking about questions that you may have. Be attentive to that question section of your journals because that question may be what your final paper is about. You know what I mean? And that's one of the reasons also why I have that section. But other than that, you guys, I enjoy the time. You guys be well, get some sun, get some water, try to stay healthy, and I will see you next week. Peace.